Hi everyone. I'm going to be presenting my research paper looking at the female nude, the artist, the viewer, and the woman. I'll start with a quote by Edgar Degas. "My women are simple, honest creatures who are concerned with nothing beyond their physical occupations. It is as if you were looking through a keyhole." Over the centuries, the subject of the female nude in Western art has reflected society's expectations of and limitations towards what it means to be a woman within patriarchy. However, the subject of the female nude itself has evolved, from the way she is portrayed to the purpose of her representation, as the cultural values and moral underpinnings associated with the subject has changed. Since its reemergence into the art historical canon towards the end of the medieval era, the female nude has undergone multiple transformations. It went from being a subject of academic or high art, and in some cultures a form that was approached with great caution, due to religious and moral constraints that were associated with representing the nude female body, to a form that has been adopted by a feminist generation as an icon of liberation and reclamation of the female body in the latter half of the 20th century. Representing the female nude in works of art has operated as an endeavor to construct a vessel to contain female sexuality and femininity itself, while on the other hand, the pursuit has sought to somehow order and control this unruly subject and place it within the confines of academic artistic discourse. Within the parameters of high art, the female body has transformed into a symbol, a metaphor for the value of beauty in general. However, when it comes to presenting the female body, the lines between what is illicit and licit, what is obscene versus what is art, can be quite blurred even today. What is clear, however, from a study of the evolution of the female nude since Botticelli put paint to canvas and executed one of the most famous monumental female nudes of all time, his Birth of Venus, to when Paula Modersohn Becker painted her most critically acclaimed self-portrait in 1906, is a distinct change in the gender of the artist and a change in the regard for the subject by both the artist and the viewer. At the time when Botticelli painted his Venus, female artists were a rarity, while female artists painting nude self-portraits or portraits of nude models was absent altogether. Hence, the female nudes from Botticelli's time were intended to provide a view of a woman, her sensuality, and her role in society through a male lens. Botticelli created an idealized Venus that served the purpose of symbolically representing the duties of a woman as a wife, as a bearer of future children for her husband, whereas Modersohn Becker in the early 20th century broke through these social constraints and expectations to paint the first nude portrait of a woman by a woman in her quest to discover her own identity as a woman who was also an artist in a male-dominated art world. At the turn of the 20th century, thus, one finds the female nude to have been transformed into a subject of self-expression by an increasing number of female artists. Because it no longer remained a subject solely accessible to the male artist, we see a shift away from the often obvious lascivious male gaze to a reflection of how women viewed the nude female form. It is the purpose of this essay to explore this evolution of the female nude, its role in a wide sociocultural context, and its relationship with both the artist and the viewer by studying a handful of examples on this subject from the Renaissance to the present day. One of the first monumental nudes painted within the realms of academic art was the aforementioned Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli circa 1486. The goddess Venus is depicted here fully naked, as a fully naked, self-assured woman, demure nonetheless, and Botticelli makes no attempt to hide the fantastical realm of an idealized landscape in which he situates her. Botticelli diverts from the near obsession of the times with a credible evocation of the physical environment. For instance, the perfect wavelets on the surface of the sea that Venus is born from, the lack of shadows cast by the figures shown, and the way in which Venus is unbound by any natural laws. For her pose, although graceful, pushes her so far to the right that it would have been impossible for her to maintain her balance. Her ample curves and her long neck and limbs are all a celebration of the pagan ideal of female beauty and a reference to the ancient pagan ritual that guides newly wedded wives to their conjugal duties. During this era and in the times preceding it, depiction of the female nude as a subject of art was looked down upon because the female body was seen as the locus of lustful desires that led men away from salvation. Ancient epithalamia, a form of poetry that is written to encourage the bride's journey into the marital chamber just after marriage, provided artists and poets in the Renaissance era with the classical precedent to view Venus as a symbol of sexual response in context of marriage ceremonies. And these were presumably the connections that Botticelli was making as he painted the sexualized and erotic nude version of Venus that we see here. Her classical basis justifies her nudity, but her nuptial association gives her the legitimacy to the sensory pleasure that nudity elicits. Botticelli's Venus was a guide and encouragement for a newly wedded woman to urge her to her duties as a wife. Through the various elements of his composition, Botticelli represents the idealized female as the goddess Venus, who, along with her mythical reference, works in harmony to help the woman to fulfill her obligations as a wife and a bearer of future children for her husband. The very first example of the female nude depicted in the reclining pose is seen in artist Giorgioni's painting, The Sleeping Venus, circa 1510, which was completed by Titian. There are subtle allusions to the sexual nature of Venus as she is portrayed here, the figure's arm being raised behind her head and the conspicuous positioning of the other hand on her pubic area. Next slide. Sorry. No doubt that Giorgioni's version of the reclining female nude was an obvious influence to Titian as he was painting his female nude in the mid to late 16th century. Following in the footsteps of Giorgioni's Sleeping Venus, Titian went on to create one of the very first instances in Western academic art when the female nude is portrayed with blatant sexual connotations. His Venus of Urbino, circa 1538. The previous slides. Thank you. In earlier versions of a similar pose, one might have supposed that the placement of the hand to cover her breasts and her pubic area was a reference to the woman attempting to hide her most private parts from scrutiny. Titian's Venus of Urbino is almost coy in her steady gaze towards the viewer, as if inviting us to wonder about whatever little is left to imagination. There is no mistaking the careful way in which Titian places her hand that covers the figure's pubic area at the very center of the composition, where the painting is bisected by the screen directly behind Venus. It is intended to draw the attention of the viewer at once to this part of the body. Titian took great care in placing the different elements in this composition, and each element had a symbolic meaning. The posy of red roses that the figure holds in her right hand symbolizes love. The fact that they are fading and that one has fallen off from the branches might signify a fading or dying love. The small dog at her feet is a symbol of loyalty, fidelity, and sexual profligacy, but that the dog is asleep might suggest just the opposite. Reasons for commissioning this painting is undetermined, and many scholars have different views on this, but there can be no doubt that Titian made no attempt at hiding the overly erotic theme of the painting, portraying a provocative nude female, confident in her nudity, and staring directly at her viewer. Artists of this era still relied on idealization of the female figure and depicting the physical form through idealized geometry, possibly from an influence from antiquity. Titian contrasts the rigid vertical lines of the architecture in the background with the curves of the female form, and he shifts as more focus was being slowly shifted to the depiction of the seductiveness of the female body and the sensual allure of a recumbent, naked woman. No doubt part of that allure lay in the vulnerability of the posture. She lay prone and exposed, defenseless, and her body an invitation to the lascivious male gaze. In order to understand the historical precedence of a female artist painting a nude self-portrait, it is essential to look at the work of Artemisia Gentileschi, the Italian Baroque painter, specifically her female nudes from the 1620s and her later self-portrait. Being a woman possibly put her in a special position and convinced her clients of her ability to relate to female characters better. But with the final product of these commissions, however, Gentileschi detracted from the norm of portraying the female as a subject passively available to the male viewer, idealized in her sexual appeal and beauty. In fact, common descriptions of her nudes were homely and uncomely, and plain in face and limb. Hence, the physical attractiveness and sexual attraction of Gentileschi's women thus denied, one is free to state that the image of Cleopatra, which we see here, joins other characters created by Artemisia to exemplify her radical reconception of female excellence as a reflection of inner worth rather than of conventional external beauty. Gentileschi is perhaps the best example of a female painter in her times who broke widely held perception of what it meant to be a female artist, with her self-portrait as the allegory of painting. She made an audacious claim upon the core of artistic tradition to create an entirely new image that was quite literally unavailable to any male artist, indicating an identification with her profession on a plane of greater self-awareness. In this self-portrait, Artemisia depicts herself engaged in her craft, surrounded by a number of attributes that have been associated with the female personification of painting. The golden chain around her neck with the mask pendant stands for her skill in the art of imitation. Unruly locks of hair that symbolize the divine frenzy of the artistic temperament, and the drapel congiante, or garment with changing color, which again alludes to the painter's skill. In Artemisia's radically simplified picture, the artist emerges as the forceful embodiment of the allegory of painting. Here, painter, model, and concept are one and the same, and the environment of the artist's studio is evoked by the barest of means. In this work alone, Artemisia effectively delivered her response against the widely held view that artists were manual laborers, less glamorous than other artistic professionals, and the view that women were unintellectual. At the brink of the transition in the 19th century from realism to Impressionism, Manet's Olympia is another important example in the canon of female nudes. Manet is looking back to and referencing not only the posture employed by Titian in the Venus of Urbino, but he is also possibly providing a commentary on the subject matter at hand. The ideal proportions of her body, her soft yet inviting expressions, and the symbols of fidelity and fecundity that surround Titian's nude on the top are replaced by the challenging gaze of Manet's Olympia, surrounded by the symbols of her trade, prostitution. The hypocrisy of the way the female nude was posed until this point for the male voyeur was well recognized by art critics throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. However, faced with Olympia and her challenging gaze, along with the deadly pallor of her skin, these same critics abandoned their reasoned responses to these problematically sexualized nudes and could only cry scandal and see death. Manet took the same composition right down to the positioning of the pillows underneath the figure, the placement of her legs one on top of the other, the drapery behind her, and turned it around into something altogether different. Something that stirred a widespread panic not just in the salon critic circles of Paris at the time, but in the general public as well. The reason behind that has been under heated debate at least since the 1920s, when Paul Jamac commented, "Everything about the Olympia caused displeasure, scandal, indignation." Antonin Proust, a lifelong friend of Manet, affirms that the administration of the salon had to set a special guard over it to prevent the canvas from being slashed by some avenger of morality. For the moralist, it seems, was as offended as the aesthete. What shocked the contemporary audiences was not Olympia's nudity or the presence of a fully clothed black maid by her bedside, but a direct and confrontational gaze and the various details in the composition that identified her without a doubt as a courtesan. The orchid in her hair, the luxurious oriental shawl on which she lies, her bracelet and pearl earrings are all symbols of her affluence and sensuality. But at the same time, Manet replaces the small dog in Titian's Venus of Urbino with a black cat, a symbol of prostitution, and whereas Venus had the palm of her left hand lightly rested on her pubic area so as to hint sexual allure, Olympia, in contrast, places her hand firmly as if to protect her sex and assert her sexual dominance over and independence from men. Another aspect of the painting that was more confusing than shocking to at least the male viewers of Manet's work was the identity of the black servant who is seen offering a bouquet, probably from a client or admirer of Olympia. and whose presence is completely ignored by Olympia. As Bernheimer points out, the spectator is to a degree represented in the painting by the maid, who differentially offers flowers but is ignored. And the male viewer's sense of being represented from a recessive position of servitude and mediation contributes to this discomfort with the image. Manet thus challenges the very ideas that surrounded the portrayal of the female nude as an object of male desire and domination. And with his Olympia, he presents the abhorring idea of a sexually independent and aware woman. As we approach the late 19th and early 20th century, the work of German painter Paula Modersohn-Becker is an important consideration in this discussion. During the 19th century, female artists entered the mainstream art scene in larger numbers than ever before, including the likes of Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot, Mary Denise Villers, to name just a few. The domain of self-portraiture where Paula Modersohn-Becker broke fresh ground was in painting a female nude with herself as the subject. In late 1906, her daring half-length nude with flowers in her hand and hair followed an earlier version she had created in May of the same year of a half-length nude where she pictured herself as pregnant even though she was not at the time. A short excerpt from her famous and well-publicized diary entry of 1900 is quite apt here. I know I shall not live very long, but why should this be sad? Is a festival more beautiful for lasting longer? For my life is a festival. My sensuous perceptions grow sharper as though I were supposed to take in everything within the few years that will be offered to me. And if now love also will blossom for me before I leave, and if I shall have painted 3 good pictures, then I shall leave willingly with flowers in my hand and in my hair. Modersohn-Becker has been the coveted subject of feminist studies for many reasons, not the least of which was her lifelong struggle to reconcile the demands of making art with the duties of a married woman. Her self-portraits have been the inspiration for my study in many ways. There is a sense of poignant self-worth that comes through in her diary entry and the self-portrait that followed it. And it is impossible to separate Modersohn-Becker's lifelong quest to find her identity as an artist and as an individual from these final words. In the painting titled Self-Portrait, Age 30, Sixth Wedding Day, as we see laborious and decisive strokes of paint analyze the weight and shape of a woman's pregnant body. Each stroke has been left to look like paint tracked by a brush, thick oil paste pushed and spread by brush strokes. It is rather curious that she inscribed this particular painting with this title and used the initials of her maiden name at the same time, because at this point in her life she had just separated from her husband. Modersohn-Becker had written that by the time she was 30, she saw herself as becoming somebody, and indeed, by the year 1906, when she did turn 30, she had made something of herself with paintings that were unprecedented in history. It is not unreasonable to assume that the intent of her titling this particular work such was perhaps to point out to herself as well as to her descendants her achievement to become somebody as she had planned for herself for her 30th year, despite her failed marriage. Stamp continues, art historian Stamp continues to make another crucial point, which is the main focus of my study. A woman painting herself as a life-size nude was simply unthinkable before 1906. The naked woman was until then the model, the subject of study, and the engendering muse for male artists. Modersohn-Becker broke with this rule. Having to decide between art and family, Paris and warp speed, at the border of the 19th century and the modernist avant-garde, she paints herself, confident, the embodiment of the new woman, the female artist. The focus on the female nude had firmly shifted from solely an object of that voyeuristic male gaze to a position of self-proclamation, of announcing the identity of the female artist as the individual that she was. The fact that the female nude was hitherto never painted as a self-portrait is no doubt the reason behind this difference in the treatment of the subject. From a position of looking at herself in the mirror, either a literal or figurative one, and painting what she saw, the female artist painted a female nude that championed the ideas of independence from the male gaze and male subordination. The female nude could have a substantial existence outside the realm of being an object of desire for male eyes. Mutterson Becker not only opened the door to a new genre of painting, the female nude as self-portrait, she also greatly shaped the works of many female artists to emerge in the century that followed. Susan Valadon, Frida Kahlo, and Amrita Shergill, to name just a few, whose art was markedly influenced by Mutterson Becker's. With regard to the self-portrait as a traditional category of painting, she ushered in a new era. And with her naked self-portraits, she founded a new genre of portraits, inspiring artists to make their own bodies the subject of their pictures. Mutterson Becker's nudes changed forever the perception of the female nude in art, both by the artist as well as by the viewer. As a self-portrait, the female nude was at once a commentary on and a response to the previously held view of women in society, their role as an object of female lust and as a dutiful wife and mother. Freed from execution by the male artist alone, and as frequently lascivious gaze, the female nude arrived in the 20th century through Mutterson Becker's self-portrait as a landmark of emancipation. Thank you.